Part 1. What is tea? Tea, the beverage, is made from the leaves and buds of a particular plant, the Camellia sinensis, also known as the tea tree. Now, the Camellia sinensis is actually an evergreen. It produces white flowers, and it's native to Southeast Asia, where it thrives in areas of high altitudes and heavy moisture. So, needless to say, it took very well to the Himalayas, and essentially grew wild for millennia across the Himalayas on both the Indian and the Chinese sides. Though the beverage wasn't really discovered or noticed until about 2700 BC, when the Chinese began preparing tea as a medicinal beverage. And for the next few thousand years, it was basically part of what we call ancient Chinese medicine. It's not really until the 600s, around the Tang dynasty, that tea is starting to be used as a social custom and as a pleasure beverage. And from there, it spreads to Japan in around 1200, and then in the 1600s to 1800s, spread by the Europeans to various other colonies across the world, most heavily adopted by the British and Dutch. Now, wherever anyone drinks tea, and it is pretty much consumed in every country on earth, there are basically three approaches to it. Some people see tea as a medicine, as having medicinal value, either for weight loss or the prevention of gallstones or for the curing of headaches. There's also those who see tea as a source of nutrition, being a source of vitamins, antioxidants, or other good nutrients for the human body. And then lastly, and most importantly to me, those who enjoy tea simply as a pleasure beverage, in the same way that we might enjoy brandy or wine, simply for its good taste and sharing with friends. But no matter which way you take it, tea has grown since 2700 BC into the modern era into the world's second most popular beverage. Only water is consumed more. Today we create about 10 billion pounds annually of tea over several dozen countries. So, again, what is tea? Tea is a beverage, one of the world's most popular drinks, made particularly from the leaves and buds of one plant and one plant only, Camellia sinensis. And it's very important because herbal teas, or tisanes, they're also very nice drinks, but they are not Camellia sinensis. That's why we call them tisanes and herbal teas, not tea. Tea, Camellia sinensis. Any other plant, herbal teas. And so there you go. That's tea. Let's move on to part 2. Part 2. Where does tea come from? As we said before, the tea tree is native to Southeast Asia, particularly the Himalayan regions. So it is native to India, China, but also countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, where it has been somewhat cultivated over the millennia, but really China is the main country that developed a big tea culture and a science of tea cultivation. From China, it primarily spread to Japan in 1200 AD, and Japan becomes the next great tea culture. The Europeans then arrive in the area around the 1600s and immediately begin trading with China for this magical beverage that they had heard about. And then there's a period of great confusion. From 1600 to 1800, the Europeans, particularly the British and the Dutch, try very, very hard to learn China's secrets of how tea is prepared and produced. And China hid this information, and it took 250 years for the Europeans to learn more about the beverage and begin their own tea plantations in their own colonies. So it is the British and the Dutch who spread tea from China to India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, but also the African colonies of Kenya and Malawi, and South American territories such as Argentina and Brazil. Now, there was tea in India prior to this. There is a form of the tea tree that is native, and that variation is called Assamica. However, the Indians did not know anything about the tea beverage. Certain tribes would simply chew the tea leaves for a long time for a little perk. But it really was the Chinese who invented the beverage, and then the Europeans who spread that technology to their own colonies in the 1800s. Now, over the years, tea has been grown many, many places. It's a very hardy plant and actually can grow almost anywhere in the world, including the United States at one time in history. But unfortunately, as a commercial product, as a commercially viable crop, it has really only succeeded in a few dozen countries across the world, where you need a certain kind of intersection of weather, soil, and cost of labor. So while tea is a hardy plant that can grow just about anywhere, it is only commercially viable in a few countries. Now today, its top 10 producers are, ready? China, India, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Turkey, Iran, Indonesia, Argentina, and Japan. And also Malawi, Uganda, and Nepal are noticeable producers of tea. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to get tea from those countries. Most of the tea that we drink in the West is from either China, India, or Sri Lanka, with a little Indonesia thrown in there. But if you drink tea bags that you might get from other tea companies, chances are you've had Indonesian and African tea as well. They are very frequently used as filler material in blends because unlike the other countries, they produce tea year-round and it's very affordable. Tea in countries like Turkey and Vietnam are not usually exported. They are usually used only in the local economy for home consumption. But the big answer, where does tea come from? It originally comes from China. From China, it spread to Japan, then India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, as well as parts of Africa and South America. Today, tea is grown in several dozen countries in the billions and billions of pounds. And hopefully, as time goes on, we'll see better and better teas coming from these areas. Part 3. What are the classes of tea? All right, so now you know what the tea plant is, you know what the tea beverage is. So now let's talk about the classes. There are 6 classes or major categories of tea. Even though they all come from the same plant, the way we prepare those leaves once they are harvested changes them into one of these 6 classes. But before we go any further, there's a really important note I want to make here, and I cannot stress this enough, okay? Ready? What you call black tea is red tea. I'm really serious about this, and I hope you can bear with me on this, all right? When Europeans first landed in the ports of China and started trading in tea, they really didn't know what they were dealing with. So they named the classes of tea by the color of the dried leaves. They saw dark black dried leaves, they saw green dried leaves, they called them black tea, green tea. That's why the British, and in turn the Americans, used the terms black tea and green tea. But this is not correct, all right? Chinese is the language of tea, has been for thousands of years, so we defer to China. But in Chinese, the phrase black tea, hei cha, has a very specific meaning. It is one of the 6 classes of tea, specifically pu'er, or fermented tea. What Americans and other Westerners call black tea is in Chinese called hong cha, red tea. And again, the reason is because Europeans named them by the color of the dried leaves, but in Chinese, we name the classes of tea by the color of the beverage itself, the actual liquor, the tea itself. And if you look carefully at your cup of English breakfast, you'll notice that it's sort of reddish brown. It's not really black. Whereas if you ever get some pu'er, you'll find that it is actually quite dark, almost as black as coffee, and you can't see to the bottom of the cup. So, don't call it black tea, or at least don't call it black tea here. If you want to call it black tea somewhere else, I can't really stop you. But red tea is the correct term, hong cha, red tea. So let's go back to the beginning. There are 6 classes of tea. They are black, red, oolong, green, white, and yellow. I wonder if we should start at yellow. Nah, we'll start at black. All right, black tea. Pu'er is the most famous example of black tea, though there are others, and maybe you've heard of that. Black tea is actually fermented. It is allowed to, you compress it into these cakes or bricks, and you let bacterial action start to enzymatically change the tea. It's actually very similar to composting in that regard. It creates its own internal heat and digests some of the chemicals within the tea and modifies them. And so pu'er is noticeably very dark, very pungent, but has certain medical benefits or perceived medical benefits throughout Chinese history. Remember, as we said, tea is either medicine, nutrition, or pleasure. Pu'er is more along that medicine side of things. It's kind of recommended for weight loss or flagging energy or digestive issues, etc. Now, personally, we don't really like to make health recommendations here, but we do find pu'er to be a very complex, robust beverage. It's very, very interesting, actually. It's pungent and aromatic and very energizing, but it really is very, very, very different to what Americans have called black tea in the past. Again, red tea. So that's the next class. Red tea, hong cha, is oxidized. Now, to make this even more confusing, we used to use the word fermented for the process of oxidation. That's also not correct. Unfortunately, the tea world is sort of filled with these misnomers and bad nomenclature because of the translation issues, and we'll sort this all out someday. But red tea is oxidized, and oxidizing is basically the same as unwrapping a banana and watching it turn brown over time. Exposure to oxygen changes the tea leaf fundamentally. And on top of that, we also maybe bash it, roll it, mash it, toss it, do other things that literally bruise the leaf and cause little chemical changes to start happening inside, which is how the leaf goes from its natural green to the dark brown or black that we are familiar with the red tea. Now, oxidation serves several purposes. The primary one is the creation of caffeine. Caffeine is actually a byproduct of the oxidation process. Green tea has almost no caffeine in it, whereas red tea has tons of caffeine in it, relatively speaking, because the leaf has been allowed to bruise and darken and create this caffeine within it. The other really important thing oxidation does is it fundamentally alters the taste and the aroma of the leaf. And this is really easy to understand. If you compare fresh green grass and that kind of bright light aroma to dark, dry brown leaves and that woodsy, musty aroma, well, there you go. That's the difference between non-oxidized and oxidized. So red tea tends to have bolder flavors, less floral aroma, more woodsy or malty aromas, and a good warm body, which makes it particularly good for blending with milk, as Westerners usually like to drink their tea. So red tea, oxidized. The next type is oolong, and oolong is between red and green because it is only semi-oxidized. Like red, it is allowed to bruise and change color and create some caffeine, but if red is 100 and green is 0, oolong is anywhere in the middle there between 40 and 70. It'll only be partially oxidized so that you get some of the best qualities of both leaves, the floral aroma or delicacy of the green along with the body and warmth and robustness of the red. That brings us down to the green tea, and green tea is basically as close as you're going to get to a dried tea leaf. That's the idea, is that the green is locked right away, usually by pan roasting the leaves almost immediately after harvesting, and then that's it. It's not allowed to oxidize, so it never goes from green to brown, and it doesn't get those darker, maltier tastes and aromas. It stays green and fresh and light, and depending on your viewpoint, also preserves a lot of its nutritional content. Many of the antioxidants and vitamins in tea are preserved in the green and white that are not there as strongly in the red. Now, white tea is a little bit different than green tea, primarily because it's made from the finest selected leaves. What makes white tea white is actually baby fuzz. When tea leaves first start to grow, they have a fine white fuzzy down on them, or downy fuzz, either which way you want to look at it. But we pluck those leaves and immediately bake them to lock that whiteness and that fuzzy quality, because those are the youngest, tenderest, most delicate of the leaves. And that's where white tea comes from. Other than that, it is very, very similar to green tea. It's not oxidized, it's not manipulated very much. But white tea is a white leaf to begin with, whereas green tea is green leaves to begin with. That brings us to the very last class of tea, being yellow. Which honestly I've never had in my life, and you'll probably never have it in yours unless you're lucky enough to go to a tea plantation. Yellow tea is a special tea that is made right then and there on the plantation from the bush. You pluck a leaf off the bush, you quickly manipulate it and make a tea. And the only reason this exists is so that the tea farmer can sort of test the bush as it is developing so that he sees how this year's crop is going. Now, it is possible to get yellow tea, but honestly, I don't think it's worth it. It's insanely expensive because it has to be vacuum packed and sent over. But it does exist. If you ever had a chance, maybe you want to try it. But anyway, 6 major classes of tea: black, red, oolong, green, white, and yellow. Now, the most important in the West, of course, would be, well, red, and then after that, I suppose, green. Red and green are probably the 2 most popular in the West, but red by a long shot. Whereas in the Far East, by and large, it's green and white are the most highly prized, though oolongs and reds are now really coming along and becoming more popular in the modern era. As for pu'er, the black tea, well, that has a certain set of adherents for its medical benefits throughout history and all over the place. I wouldn't say it's popular anywhere per se, but those who love it exclusively. And yellow tea, again, that's something that only on a tea plantation are you ever likely to see or have. But there you go. Those are the 6 classes of tea. Which brings us to part 4. Part 4. How is tea made? Okay, so we've established that tea is made from the leaves and buds of the Camellia sinensis, which is grown in several dozen countries across the world, and made into one of the 6 classes of tea. So the next question, obviously, is how do we make those classes of tea? What are the steps? We'll begin with the tea bush. Now, we did say that tea is a tree, and if it was left to grow wild, it would in fact grow to be a very straight, long, narrow tree. But that's not really convenient for cultivation, so farmers will prune the tree and keep it in a short form like a shrub, basically 4 to 6 feet tall, a whole bunch of leaves, easily reached. Now, tea is generally plucked manually. No one has really made a successful automated machine for this purpose yet, though don't get me wrong, they've been trying for centuries. But traditionally, actually, most tea is plucked by women and children, and it's not for any nasty reason. It's simply because they have the smallest, most delicate fingers and will do the least damage to the tea bush when plucking those leaves. Now, a tea bush, once those leaves are plucked, will simply grow another set of leaves, and we will harvest them again at a later time in the year. These harvests are called flushes, and you might hear the term first flush, second flush, third flush. The tea year starts in springtime, so that very first plucking, that's called first flush, and then you might have another harvest in summertime or another harvest in autumn. Whereas in other places in the world, particularly in Africa, tea actually flushes year-round, and so is constantly being plucked every few weeks. And this is very useful for the tea industry because it's nice to have a supply that is always available as opposed to only being plucked in spring or autumn. But anyway, the first step in making tea, needless to say, is to pluck those leaves and buds from the tea bush. Now, generally, we like to pluck the youngest, most nubile leaves and the buds on the ends of the branches, but we do also use some of the larger, rougher leaves, the older leaves, further down on the branch. And these different leaf grades, they are called, are used to make different styles of tea. Now, I don't mean different classes of tea. Large leaves can be used to make either red or green tea. They'll just have different characteristics because the leaf is older and has dealt more with weather and insects and humans and wind and sun, etc. But the second step, once the leaves have been plucked from the tea bush, is for them to be sorted and selected. And that's when we sort out our tea leaves based on their size and their age so that we have a consistent set of leaves to prepare. Because the next couple of steps, there's often some baking or toasting or some kind of transformation that takes place. And in the same way that you don't cook 2 really different sized pieces of meat because one would burn before the other one even gets warm, we want the same size leaves for this next part of the process so that everything is made consistently. Not that we would have one leaf very, very dark and one leaf only half dark. That wouldn't be any good to us. So first we pluck, then we sort and select, and then from there the leaf will go in different directions depending on what class of tea you're making. And now we've already established that green tea is not oxidized, so green tea will be fired or fixed, a step we're going to talk about in just a moment, right away. White tea similarly will be baked to lock its qualities right away so that it does not oxidize. Now, oxidation, as we discussed, was something like unwrapping a banana and allowing it to turn brown over time. Red and oolong teas will be allowed to go through this process. There are several different ways to do this. Could just be laid out on a wicker mat in the sun. It could be baked in an oven. It could be held in an iron pan over fire and tossed by hand. That's the traditional method. Sometimes a combination of all of the above, but there will also be tossing and rolling and shaping and all kinds of stuff. But all these processes, or this part of the process, is purely there to get that leaf bruised and darkening and then stopping it at the right point. So we don't want it to over-oxidize, but when we get it to the leaf to the desired level of oxidation, boom, that's when we hit up our next step, which is fixing. Fixing is the process of locking the leaf. Basically, once you have removed enough moisture from the leaf, it will no longer oxidize. It will no longer change. So obviously, green tea, we do this very early in the process, and it still shares the green color of its fresh counterparts. Whereas red tea, we go through the sun drying or the pan toasting or what have you until the right moment when, boom, that's when we fix it by really getting all the last moisture content out of it and locking its color and degree of doneness. Now, somewhere along this process, depending on the type of tea, there's going to be what we call manipulation or forming. Manipulation or forming means either hand rolling or using a machine of some kind to render the leaf into a certain shape or a certain style. And that would include twisting the leaves into long little eyebrow forms or rolling the leaves into little pearls or pellets. But somewhere along the way, a human or a machine might get that leaf and do something to it to get the shape or style that you see at the end. And the very last step from all that is it being packed and sold. Go figure. Now, it might be sold directly to you as the consumer, but more likely it's going to be sold to a large tea company that then blends it or grinds it up and uses it in tea bags or does something really awful to it and makes bottled iced tea. But we just won't even worry about that. But those are the main steps of tea preparation. From bush to cup, it is plucking, sorting, selecting, oxidizing, forming, fixing, and packing, and there you go. So the last question for today, let's get to part 5. Part 5. So what are all these kinds of tea anyway? So I know this is a little confusing. We've talked about the 6 classes of tea. And, there you go, these 6 great categories. But then you go into a tea shop like this one and you see all this. You got Assam and Darjeeling and gunpowder and sencha and Buddha's palm and, what are all these kinds of tea? So here we are, part 5. What are all these kinds of tea? There's no set system to naming tea. All right, just in case there's any confusion about this. There's no standardization. There's no international tea body that has rules about how teas are named. But thanks to tradition and over the few hundred years of the tea industry's history at this time, there are certain names that have become very commonplace. So let's start going through those types of names. The first one, most obvious, is regional teas. Teas that are named from the place from which they come. So Assam is a province in India. Darjeeling is a province in India. Ceylon is the old name of Sri Lanka. Java is a funny name for one of the islands of Indonesia. If you see a tea called Java, that's what that means. It means this tea came from Java, Indonesia. And if you see tea marked Kimun, that means it came from the province of Ximen, China. Kimun is its old name. These are regions. Now, the important thing about this is that it's not a single tea from a single plantation. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of tea plantations in a given area. And so when a tea merchant, such as myself, or another tea merchant, has a Kimun tea, what that really is a blend of teas from various estates within the Ximen province that have been blended and balanced in such a way as to have a consistent flavor and aroma that the consumer expects. Now, what that means is that tea's been around long enough that people have ideas of what Darjeeling tea should look, taste, and smell like, or what a Yunnan tea should look, taste, and smell like. Now, because it's an agricultural product, tea does not always grow the same every year. One year might be much less rain or much more sun or much less heat or what have you than the previous year. The tea plant will change because of that. And so it's up to the blenders to counterbalance the teas and try to create a consistent flavor and presentation so that the consumer knows this Kimun tea is not going to be exactly like last year's Kimun, but it's going to be very, very, very close. And we are reasonably well assured that all the teas come from that province. Which brings me to the second style of naming teas, the regional styles. And this gets a little confusing. Kimun is a particular province in China. There's a particular type of tea that comes from there. So Kimun is that province's blend of teas. But there could also be a Formosa Kimun, which is a Kimun style tea made in Formosa, which is the old name for Taiwan. And that's if they're being nice. They don't have to call it Formosa Kimun. They could still just call it Kimun because it is tea made in Kimun style, a regional style. Now, thankfully, this kind of naming convention is sort of going by the wayside as we move into the modern era. You don't really see false Darjeelings that are not from Darjeeling anymore, but you used to. You used to see it rather a lot because the Europeans were really very heavily competing with each other and copying each other's styles, and the Chinese have done this too in their history. But you've got regions and you've got regional styles. Both mean the same thing. This tea is supposed to be in the style of, in the expected flavor and aroma of this province's or this location's tea. The difference between the two is simply a real Kimun comes from Kimun, and a Kimoun style does not. But again, we're not seeing as many of these regional styles as time goes on. Speaking of style, that would be the next type of tea naming convention. And I'm sorry, I know this is getting a little confusing, but when you start thinking about certain green teas, maybe you've heard of gunpowder. It's not made from gunpowder. There is no place in China called gunpowder. Gunpowder refers to the actual form of the tea leaf, the shape of it. It's rolled into these little pellets that reminded the European traders of gunpowder, even though it's much more pleasantly named in Chinese as pearl tea. But gunpowder or chunmei or Buddha's palm oolong, these kinds of names refer to the style of the leaf, the style of the way that tea has been manipulated and prepared. There is no set standard formula for what Buddha's palm oolong is. You know, bear in mind, remember, all of these teas are made from the same plant. They're all made from the same Camellia sinensis. And they're all plucked from the same Camellia sinensis bush the same way. Just some leaves are used for white, some leaves are used for green. But it's how we prepare and manipulate them after that that make the different classes. And in the case of green tea, the oldest of the styles of tea, the Chinese weren't really thinking about, marketing names back in the day. Tea was simply described by, oh, this is the pearl style, or this is the chunmei style, this is the Buddhist palm style. And again, over the course of millennia, you get used to what you can expect from a chunmei, what you can expect from a gunpowder. And so you have many teas, particularly in the green and oolong world, as well as the white tea world, that are named for their leaf style. All right, you still with me? That's 3 of them. Next one are the scented teas. Scented teas are really obvious. Jasmine. We don't say jasmine Yunnan, we don't say jasmine gunpowder usually. We just say jasmine. It's jasmine scented tea. Same with vanilla. You don't usually know what the tea is underneath the vanilla because that's not really important. The important thing was the vanilla and that the blend is balanced to, complement that vanilla. Earl Grey, being one of the most famous scented teas in the world, is just called Earl Grey. You don't necessarily know what tea is in there. You just know that it has been scented with the oil of bergamot, and that's what you expect. So scented teas are named for the scenting because that's the primary important ingredient to us. After that come the blends. All right, blends are a different deal entirely. The tea industry is pretty old, and you got to bear in mind that a lot of this stuff started up before the invention of things like copyrights and trademarks. So English breakfast, for example, one of the most famous tea blends in the world, English breakfast, traditionally is a blend of 3 kinds of tea from 3 different English colonies, hence the name. But there is no set formula for this. One person's English breakfast might be these 3 teas in this kind of formula, and another person's English breakfast are 2 of those same teas with a completely different third tea and a different formula. Blends are, again, named in such a way so that the customer knows what to expect. When you've had English breakfast, you know what kind of flavor you're expecting from it, so next year's English breakfast you expect to be the same. Same of Irish, same of Russian Caravan, etc., etc., etc. But these are all blends, and blends usually have colorful names that are not necessarily very descriptive, but have become part of the tea trade over time as tradition, and in some cases because of marketing. Things are a little bit more confusing nowadays because now we do have trademark and copyright rules and labeling laws, and a lot of this stuff is still getting worked out. But traditionally, blends don't have any very descriptive name. It's just the blend name, and you don't need to worry about it. It's the tea blender's business, what teas go in there and how he balances them out every year. For what it's worth, by the way, I'd like to take a little segue here to discuss something called masala chai, known just as chai in the United States. Please don't ever ask for chai tea. Okay, don't go into a place and ask for chai tea. And if you see a place that has a sign in the window that says we have chai tea, feel free to point and laugh. Masala is the Indian word for spice blend. Chai is the Indian word for tea. Masala chai means spiced tea. So if you see someone calling for chai tea, they're saying tea, and just give up right there. After that, the last kind of name for teas, and this is sort of the future of tea. This is a bright future I hope we move towards. But there's an increasing interest these days on the consumer side for single origin teas, teas from a single estate. Now, traditionally, that would be something more left for people in the tea industry, the blenders. needed to know what estate does this come from, what leaf grade, how is it prepared, etc. And nowadays, you're starting to see consumers also interested in this information. You know, you may have grown up on a Darjeeling blend and really love Darjeeling tea, but now you can get a tea just from one estate in Darjeeling and another tea from this estate and compare them so that you can see what the different qualities are and how they balance against each other, or even blend them yourselves. But this is where you start seeing those really crazy names like Darjeeling Sungma Estate STFGOP1. This whole thing is a descriptive code, basically, for what province, what estate, what leaf grade, how is it prepped. But this kind of information used to be very common in the tea industry, and you know, sort of in the back end for the merchants and the blenders. But you are starting to see, depending on where you go and where you shop, more merchants selling tea that way. And I really hope that becomes a trend. In the same way that wine has matured as an industry and wine drinkers are learning more and more about the beverage and are starting to appreciate single vintages, single grapes, etc. Tea is also kind of growing up that way, and people are showing more of an interest in single origin teas so that they can learn more about this wonderful drink. But anyway, so what do these names mean? I'm so sorry. They kind of can mean whatever the heck you want them to mean. Now, I try to keep consistent here. Kimon, Darjeeling are from Kimon and Darjeeling. I can't answer for other tea merchants. I wish I could. But as time goes on, I'm hoping that people will be a little bit more demanding of their tea sellers to declare where something comes from, how did it get here, who blended it, who oversaw the whole process. But in the meanwhile, we're still sort of in this halfway place. A lot of people don't really want to get involved in all these different little single estates. They just want Darjeeling. So you see regions, you see styles, you see regional styles, you see scented, you see blends, and you see single origin. And that's about it for today. So those are the very, very basic questions about tea. If you are interested in learning more about tea, you can certainly contact us, email us, or just visit us at the store here at 11th and Pine in Philadelphia. I thank you for taking the time, and I'll see you soon.